Hi, my name is Shamtoli Haq. I'm the editor of Law at the Margins. Law at the Margins is an innovative law and social justice platform bringing together lawyers, organizers, and activists committed to social change and social justice. Today, we're really excited to host a webinar program on sanctuary schools and sanctuary campuses. Before I introduce our panelists, let me tell you a little bit about the format for today. So first of all, welcome to all of you who have registered and are watching this program live. We know that many among you are already organizing or thinking about organizing sanctuary schools and campuses. We invite you to use the chat feature on the side of the platform to introduce yourselves. The format is that we will first hear from our guest speakers, and then we'll open up to some speakers from our co-sponsoring organizations. And here I'd like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsoring organizations, the National Education Association, National Immigration Law Center, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, National Day Labor Organizing Network. And we'll hear a little bit from our speakers from our co-sponsoring organizations, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So throughout the webinar, I will be using the chat feature to post questions and responses that you may have and field that to our panelists. So let me introduce to you all our panelists for today. We're really excited to have with us Ariana Martinez. Ariana Martinez is a professor at LaGuardia Community College. She has her PhD from Rutgers University in Urban Planning and Geography. Her PhD thesis has been around looking at Latinos in municipal spaces. After we hear from Ariana, we will hear from Emma Lehaney. Emma serves as senior counsel for the National Education Association, which is the nation's largest labor organization and a leading cause for the public education. It has 3 million members, and they work at every level of education from preschool to university graduate programs. Then we'll hear from Xiuming Chier, who's the senior staff attorney and field coordinator at the National Immigration Law Center. Xiuming focuses on challenging immigration enforcement and promoting access to legal status and integrating a field strategy into NILC's issue areas. She has been a Soros Justice Fellow, and she has also been a managing attorney at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network Los Angeles Detention Project. And throughout the program, we hope to also be joined by Emmy McLean, who is an attorney and works with organizers from Movimiento Coseca around organizing approaches. She's with the National Day Labor Organizing Network. So with that, what I'd like to do is to invite Ariana Martinez to start us off with a little bit of background on the sanctuary movement and a little bit of why it's important to frame this question broadly. Just for participants to be aware of, there is a webinar guide. You can click on it to, there's on the chat feature a link to it. And there is also a link to the speaker bios. So I'm gonna hand it off to Ariana to start us off. And again, thanks to all of our co-sponsoring organizations and to our panelists for joining us today. Ariana.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm gonna start off by just saying a few things about that I'm sure many of you already know about the kind of history of sanctuary, and how, you know, we're kind of using that term at CUNY and in universities. Historical moment was in the 80s with the Central Americans coming across the border and the kind of refugee moment. and then even cooperation with ICE agreements between cities and counties and the federal government in terms of secure communities and 287G agreements. So in terms of right now, the Pomona College and some of the UC schools were kind of at the forefront of proposing sanctuaries as a campus, as a university and campus movement. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at CUNY and kind of thinking about framing. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. So first I'm going to go quickly through our timeline of what we did at our campus, which, sorry, I should have said, I teach at LaGuardia Community College, which is part of CUNY in New York City. So on November 14th, a couple days after the election, we created a faculty petition to send around the campus, urging faculty to request the president to create a sanctuary campus. And then in the following 2 weeks, we kind of started doing grassroots organizing at the campus. A student petition was created that mimicked the faculty petition. We organized across departments to bring the resolution to department votes. The College Senate also took up the resolution, and we were able to have the resolution pass unanimously in almost all of the departments, as well as at the College Senate, and collect about 300 faculty signatures, as well as an additional like 300 or so student signatures, which is not a lot, honestly, in terms of the size of our student body, but we felt it was a start, because there isn't currently a big organizing culture at the campus, because it is a commuter school, and students have many obligations and are kind of generally do their political organizing in their communities rather than at the campus. So that's something that we've been trying to work to adapt to. So after the Senate resolution, we had a campus rally on December 1st, and then brought the signatures and the resolution to the president's office, where we met with her for an hour. She refused to sign the resolution, but we still felt that it was a kind of opening, because she agreed to have a committee formed to make recommendations to her. So basically what came out of this was a kind of agenda to organize from above and from below. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, and in thinking about the way that we're framing sanctuary. So from below is students and faculty and staff, the people who work directly with students. And we've identified some key priorities, because we're very weary of sanctuary just being a sort of symbolic thing. And so we're really trying to come up with concrete actions that we can take. And so the priorities that we've identified are in sort of three things: a recommitment to safety for all identities, creating a culture of a hate-free zone, safety for ideas. And then the second sort of section is a clear articulation of non-compliance and non-cooperation with enforcement, including ICE, protecting student data, new campus safety rules, and no retaliation for non-compliance for faculty or staff. And that has been an important one. And then finally, increased services. In general, CUNY needs increased services for students, but this seems like a sort of opportunity to advance things that we already need, like increased legal services, mental health, maybe an undocumented student coordinator or student center, which we don't have, and sensitivity trainings for faculty, staff, and campus security. So having those sort of as the set priorities, we had a town hall meeting for students, faculty, and staff on December 21st, because we really wanted something to happen before everyone left for break. And it was great. Like, the turnout was quite large, like around 75 people. And out of that coalition, we created 7, let's call them teams, So a team that does social media, a team that does student organizing, trainings and events, building community outside of the campus, an organizing committee like on the ground at the campus to keep getting more and more people involved, an information gathering committee. This one's kind of key because there's a lot of offices doing different things and no one really talks to each other, and so it's kind of about finding out what resources already exist. And then finally, a curriculum committee, because we do have something called the first year seminar. And we would like every faculty member that teaches that class to have an opportunity to bring some sort of committee, sorry about my dog, some curriculum to the classroom, like around these issues. So why is this? So the next thing that we have going is the organization. Sorry, just 1 second.
Yeah. What we're going to do is probably shift to Emma, just to allow for just the webinar to continue so that Ariana can rejoin us. So thanks, Ariana, for sharing with us some of the details regarding LaGuardia. And again, just to let you all know that what we're doing is asking folks to introduce yourselves in the chat. During the Q&A, we'll invite you all to share what your links to the Sanctuary movement is. But just to underscore, the purpose of this webinar is to really give you concrete steps around organizing and also the importance of building and connecting it to other movements around student rights. So again, I would like to invite Emma to maybe at this point talk about sort of the educational dimensions and the work of the National Education Association.
Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues, comrades. It's a real honor to be included in this panel. Since the election, NEA has been working more or less around the clock on immigration issues as they will confront our students and our members at any moment after the inauguration. I want to talk mainly about Board of Education resolutions. As you know, your local school district, the governing body of that school district is generally your school board. So even if you are in a sanctuary city, there is real value to getting your school board to acknowledge these issues and act on them. As Ariana was just saying, we want to move beyond just symbolic gestures. And the template resolution you find in the guide today with this webinar from pages 8 to 11 is the template we have developed here in our office at NEA. You should feel free to borrow, steal, rearrange, amend this template. It is not meant for anything but wide dissemination and to activate organizing through its use. So first, let me just quickly address, if you haven't done this before, how to pass a board resolution. You, as members of your community, can essentially lobby your school board through a variety of means. School boards are public entities subject to public meeting requirements, and even if you're not able to get on the agenda, the noticed pre-meeting agenda, most, if not all, school boards are required to set aside time for the public. So it may be your parents' organization, it may be your staff union, it may be you as an individual who can take the microphone at your next scheduled board meeting, or if you think it's an emergency, you can go to the administration and ask that the board members go through an emergency notice for a school board meeting. The resolution needs to be voted on by your school board. Again, this is more than a symbolic gesture we're trying to achieve. So even your public remarks or press releases from your superintendent or your board chair fall short of an actual resolution, which at the local district level is a form of law or regulation. It's certainly a mandatory piece of school governance once it's enacted. So if you look at the sample, or if you don't have it handy, I can sort of walk through the three main goals that I had in preparing it. First and most broadly, a resolution like this, or even discussion of one, activates organizing potentially throughout the community and sends a strong message, if passed, of support for students regardless of immigration status and for their families. We have seen in Arizona and Alabama with hostile state legislation sharp drops in school attendance shortly after those laws were passed. Regardless of political leaning, very few, if any, school districts want to see their students vanish out of fear the day after an action for immigration enforcement or a political statement from the administration. Even with Obama-directed ICE initiatives whereby ICE officers approach students on their way to school in North Carolina, we saw a sharp attendance drop off. So this could be a message that you bring to your school district about encouraging kids to continue to come to school because certain aspects of this resolution can provide protections, not absolute protections, but concrete protections. So the strong messaging was really the first purpose of preparing this template resolution. Secondly, and importantly, the resolution embeds and reaffirms existing constitutional rights. We know from the Supreme Court's decision, Plyler versus Doe, which is cited here in the guide for your reference, a decision that was reached coming out of a school district in Texas. The decision from 1982 says very clearly, all students have a right of access to free public K-12 education regardless of immigration status. So this is a clear 14th Amendment decision that is still on the books, barring a disastrous appointment from a Trump administration and the issue potentially resurfacing. This is the law of the land and can and should be a centerpiece of any board resolution, whether you cite the case or, as in our template, simply embed its principles in the local resolution. Another constitutional point I'd like to quickly touch on is the 10th Amendment, which leaves to the states a reservoir of rights and abilities to act, except where those rights are reserved to the federal government or prohibited at the state level. Education administration has historically resided with the states and through state law at the local level. So in our template, we emphasize all of the steps and powers that reside within a local or state, such that were federal litigation to arise from an intrusive immigration enforcement effort, we would be able to, pointing to this resolution, reiterate that what is called for in this resolution is not merely symbolic, nor is it overstepping into federal jurisdiction, but rather resides in the right of the school district to administer education at the local level. And three, this resolution has attached to it, as the last page, a district administration policy. Many times when a school board acts, board members are not the day-to-day administrators at your school. It could be your superintendent at the district or your principal at the school, who, when confronted with immigration enforcement questions, has to act. All of us are intimidated when confronted with armed law enforcement, particularly in an atmosphere like this from ICE. Your individual custodian, bus driver, educator, or administrator is going to want to know what to do. And school resolutions, board resolutions, are usually broader in terms than your district administrative policies. So this policy sets forward steps for staff to follow when confronted with questions like this. And you will see that it calls for staff to direct enforcement officers to centralized offices like the superintendent's office, and to give the superintendent an opportunity to consult with the school district's attorney. Now, these steps are reasonable and efficient, and so should stand up in court, but they are not assertions of local rights and powers per se. So I will caution that there are limits to the way that these steps can be enforced vis-a-vis the incredibly powerful federal immigration enforcement and intrusive ability to pursue individual enforcement cases. Nonetheless, we recommend having something specific, a multi-step process that's clear for your staff to follow and also reasonable in the eyes of a potential court reviewing it. So those are really the three goals of a template resolution. By no means does NEA purport to have the only template. National Immigration Law Center also has some excellent language, and you'll see many school boards have already adopted actual resolutions. We saw it very quickly after the election, particularly with the large urbans who have quick access to legal counsel. We saw this in Portland, Oregon. We saw this in Los Angeles, California, and in Denver, Colorado, among many others. It is with our smaller school districts that we are really hoping that local activists like yourself will roll out efforts like this, particularly if your school board is not immediately inclined, either because of political hostility or lack of knowledge, or as some school board members have told our union activists, well, nothing's happened yet, so we don't need this on the books. In fact, there's a real advantage to having this on the books before you see ICE approaching any school parking lot or bus stop, because having it in place in advance, again, lays good groundwork should a court become involved at a later date. Let me touch quickly, before we move on, if I may, on the role of staff and unions in this context. In most states that have bargaining laws, and you may be in Texas or elsewhere where there is no bargaining law, no right to bargain, nor any role for an exclusive union representative. But if you are, such as New York, California, and many others, most bargaining laws set forth that if the employer promulgates a new rule that could result in a worker's discharge or termination, that rule needs to be negotiated with the union, also known as the exclusive representative. So this resolution is not framed as directives to individual staff that could result in discipline or termination. It simply provides procedural steps for individual staff to follow and holds the district as a whole and the administrators as managers accountable. If you do at your local campus want to pursue a directive to staff that could result in discipline and you're in a bargaining state, we recommend approaching your union to initiate discussions in bargaining. Certainly beyond those strict legal rules about bargaining, you have the union as a major stakeholder in any education workplace, and so you as organizers may very well want to initiate contact with those groups. I'll pause here because I know my 10 minutes has passed and I want to make plenty of time for my colleagues.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma, for that background in terms of the educational component to sanctuary schools. We are going to be inviting back Ariana and Xiuming Cheer to talk about some of the immigration consequences to having this strategy. I do want to underscore, just from Law at the Margins perspective, that it's really important that as you're framing your petitions, and this question had come up in the chat, that we take a very intersectional perspective. We know that even before Trump administration, that there had already been an attack around immigrants, Muslims, and other vulnerable communities. And so a lot of our guests and petitions that we included in the webinar guide take an approach of taking a safe environment for all students, but recognizing that immigrants in certain communities are much particularly vulnerable to enforcement. And so the petitions and the guide sort of reflect the particularity of the moment that we're in, but at the same time, not lose sight of the fact that we should really sort of focus on all communities that are impacted as students. So we're just waiting with some technical difficulties regarding bringing in Xiuming Cheer and Ariana Martinez on the call. During this time, I just want to encourage all of you who are listening in to use the chat feature to be able to ask questions, pose comments. And also what we would like to do is, after the main panelists, invite you to share your perspectives around sanctuary schools and campuses and that you're organizing. And so please continue to use the chat feature as a way to introduce yourselves, comment on what you're doing. If you would like to speak or share your experiences locally, just flag that for me on the chat feature, and I can invite you to the screen, or I can read your comments into the webinar. We do have, it seems like, a wonderful group of participants who could easily be experts themselves on this issue. So just checking in to have Xiuming Chier to join us to walk us through some of the consequences and additional immigration considerations for having a sanctuary school or campus. Do we have, okay, so while we wait, maybe I can ask, Emma touched on this for a little bit, but maybe I can bring in Emma briefly to answer one of the questions that had come in the topic, which is a little bit more granular. Are there ways to get into the collective bargaining agreement itself on sanctuary? After Emma answered this question, I see we're joined by Xiuming. We'll invite her to talk about some of the immigration consequences.
Sure, very briefly on the collective bargaining agreement, great question. So a collective bargaining agreement is entered between the exclusive representative and the employer. The exclusive rep or union speaks on behalf of the entire bargaining unit. And thus, when the collective bargaining agreement or CBA is entered for a particular term, it stays in effect unless the two parties, the union on behalf of the workers and the employer, agree to reopen it either entirely or in part. So if you wish to reopen a collective bargaining agreement, the best thing is for a union to approach management and say, we want to reopen, to negotiate terms over sanctuary status. Absent both contractual parties agreeing to reopen, the CBA remains closed until it expires. I will make one note, which is to say that there are times when an employer will say there's been a change in law to which we must comply. For example, a new OSHA requirement. And so we're requiring that of all workers, although it's not reflected or perhaps even amends the collective bargaining agreement. Although this legal landscape is shifting, I don't believe management could solidly allege that the law in this area has changed necessarily, such as to require staff to pursue a sanctuary status on campus. So I would say if you're looking to amend or reopen a CBA, talk to the union through its governing board, its democratically elected leaders, and propose doing that with them so they can raise it with management.
Great. So again, thank you, Emma. I'm going to invite at this moment to Xiuming Chier from the National Immigration Law Center, also thankful to co-sponsor this event, to add in on their organizing work. And particularly one of the questions that comes up, I know through my own work at CUNY system, is what are the retaliation or repercussions to institutions, particularly public institutions, public colleges, in passing a sanctuary campus and school board? And then the other question is, does it matter if the name sanctuary doesn't show up? That some institutions like CUNY have taken on some of the protections, but they don't call it a sanctuary campus. So welcome, Xiuming.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this webinar. So before I delve a little bit into those legal questions, I wanted to pick up on the point you made about intersectionality. So NOC and several other organizations also created templates for sample school resolutions. And in our templates, we do include language around schools not participating in any kind of registry based on ethnicity or national origin, or religion, because we want to make sure that schools take a clear position to oppose any kind of forced registration of Muslims. We also try to incorporate in language around anti-bullying. So we also welcome feedback on our model language, particularly around issues of the school to prison pipeline and school discipline issues, because we have language saying that school police should not engage in any kind of cooperation with ICE or immigration enforcement. And we don't want to imply that otherwise the things that school police are engaged in are right, since we know that there is often a high rate of criminalization of youth of color. So we welcome any language to help us incorporate a broader perspective on criminal justice reforms and the movement against mass incarceration. We also welcome input on language that would address worker issues. So that could be both for staff that want to support immigrant students while immigrant students are engaged in protests or civil disobedience, or language itself that also provides protections for non-citizen workers who are school staff. And one other point is that there's a variety of resolutions that have been adopted across the country. Some of them also ask the schools to provide actual concrete materials support for students. For example, with the San Francisco Unified School District, they had draft language to ask the school district to fund lawyers for students and families who are facing deportation, and also for the schools to fund scholarships for immigrant students. So I think we can look at these resolutions in a very broad way beyond the core points of preventing ICE access and limiting information. We can also look at how they can really provide a welcoming space for many marginalized students who have multiple identities. So just to touch on the question of funding, because I know there's been a big question, more particularly I think addressed towards cities and counties that are adopting so-called sanctuary policies, but also potentially schools in terms of whether they could potentially lose funding if they adopt these policies. So in the education context, we're talking about Department of Education funding, which in the last fiscal year was about $15 billion. So I guess in theory, the Secretary of Education could try to reduce funding or impose some kind of requirement that any place that has a sanctuary policy would jeopardize their funding. That seems to be in conflict with the statute, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It's sort of outside the scope of the statute, so it could raise some 10th Amendment issues that Emma started alluding to. It could also raise problems in terms of sort of administrative procedure. So, it's something we're definitely keeping an eye out for, and we are concerned about, but we do feel that there would be some legal and procedural protections should the federal government attempt to defund some of these schools. And also, what these schools are doing for the most part is within the confines of existing law, so we don't think they're doing something that would actually be violating federal law. For instance, there are already protections from the release of information to other agencies without the student or the family member's consent. That's under FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which prohibits disclosing information in a student's education records without consent. And it also prohibits school districts from disclosing identifiable information to outside agencies. So we think by adopting these policies, many schools are actually just reaffirming existing law. Any attempt to report a student to ICE could potentially come into conflict with the Plyler v. Doe decision, which mandates access to education for all students regardless of their immigration status. So any attempt by a school district to actually report a student or share information would definitely have a chilling effect on immigrant students' ability to attend school. Their parents might end up not taking them to the school. So I think we can say that these actions to make sure schools don't share information or inadvertently cause immigrant students to not attend school are just in compliance with case law and also with the statute. And in the area of talking about what ICE can do, federal law already lists the times when federal ICE agents can actually arrest somebody without a judicially signed warrant. So when these policies state that ICE must produce a warrant prior to coming onto campus, again, they're just reaffirming what federal law states. and just creating policies around how exactly to evaluate the warrant, how exactly to evaluate a subpoena should I show up with one. Regarding campus police, there's many state laws. For example, in California, there is the California Trust Act, which limits the instances in which local law enforcement could detain a person for ICE. So there might already be existing limitations on what local jurisdictions can do in terms of cooperating with ICE. So that's something for people in various areas to think about in terms of making sure that at minimum the schools are complying with state law. And it's not by any means mandatory for local law enforcement to turn people into ICE or provide certain types of information to ICE. Often that's because the local law enforcement agencies voluntarily agree to do that. So to preempt that, many schools can create policies to make sure that their campus police do not actually turn people over to ICE or do not hold people for ICE. So one last thing I'll touch upon is the question of what can unions do. So, you know, part of what unions can do is, of course, supporting these policies. For their own workers, they can also adopt policies for the workplace. I think we are concerned that in the future there will be more worksite raids. So creating policies so that if ICE does show up at a workplace, requiring ICE to have a judicially signed warrant, creating a policy where somebody in the worksite reviews that warrant, also being part of raids response, whether that's providing legal support or organizing support or communication support, so that if there is a raid, whether at a work site or a school, that the unions are part of the response. And finally, being part of solidarity actions. We know that when ICE shows up, and often they single people out, or they might put people into different lines, ask people who are documented to go one line, ask people who are undocumented to go in a different line. So it's important that people practice solidarity or talk about solidarity beforehand, what that means, and make sure that once ICE shows up, that everybody agrees to remain silent, everybody agrees to not show their papers, because otherwise, if the people who have documents show those documents, that basically singles out the people who don't have documents. And then these solidarity actions are things that, of course, student groups can also think about adopting as a response and then as part of their plan if ICE does show up on their campus.
Great.
So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now invite at this point Emmy to who is from the National Day Labor Organizing Network to share a little bit about the organizing that they have done with Movimiento Cosecha and as well as with other organizing approaches. There have been a couple of questions regarding kind of what the law is, and I think it's really important for us to know sort of the bounds of the law. But I think for us to really achieve the broader goal of sanctuary that we're really proposing, both from Ariana's talk as well as the panelists, to have an intersectional analysis, we have to sort of go beyond the law. And I think in terms of doing that, that approach is only possible through organizing. So at this point, I'd like to invite Emmy to share a little bit about the organizing approaches to sanctuary. And then if we can bring Ariana back, we'll have her speak. I'm encouraging everyone to use the chat feature to comment, share resources, and after this webinar, which will be recorded, we will compile all the links and can share that around to the registrants. So continue to use and see Law at the Margins as a hub to disseminate that information. If you are organizing or beginning to organize, you can contact us directly as well, and we can link you to relevant resources. So at this point, do we have Emmy?
I'm here. I don't know if you can hear me. I can see the video, but.
Okay. So we won't be able to see your, I'm sure, your beautiful face. We'll have an icon up, so but we'll be able to hear you. So Emmy.
So my name is Emmy. I'm a lawyer, but I work with the National Day Labor Organizing Network, which does both law and organizing, and has worked with campuses and with student organizing and worker organizing and others. I'm based in Los Angeles, but we are a network of organizations across the country. And I'm going to say a little bit about the risks of campus engagement with immigration enforcement in connection with a case that we've been very closely involved in, and the importance of this movement, the power and the limits of policy change, and perhaps a little bit on what can and should be done even beyond trying to make policy change, which is obviously critically important and one of the main priorities of, I think, a lot of people who are on this call, both on the panel side and the participants at this really critical moment. The case that I'm going to describe is the case that took place at Cal State Long Beach with a man named Jose Alvarez, and it related to the collaboration between Cal State police and immigration enforcement. And it demonstrates that the importance of these efforts are not just to protect students, but also to protect members of the community, and that there can be ripple effects. So in February 2016, Jose Alvarez, who'd lived in the United States for over 30 years, has 6 US citizen children in the United States, was driving his son to work at a nearby donut shop right on the outskirts of the Cal State Long Beach campus. And the campus police stopped him because of a broken headlight, one of the infamous broken headlight stops. They were going to let him go, but because something came up on his record, which was a hold from Immigration and Customs Enforcement related to a nonviolent drug conviction from over 20 years ago, the Cal State Long Beach police brought him to a holding station called ICE, who picked him up, and within 7 hours he was in Tijuana, where he remains today. We've been organizing with a lot of the students there and others, including getting Congress people and student organizations and other organizations to sign on in support of a humanitarian parole application from him. But one of the really important things that came from that effort was really a mobilized student population, and in some ways from likely corners of the campus, and in some ways from perhaps less likely or parts of the campus. The La Raza Student Association, the Chicano student organization on campus, joined with a sociology club from the sociology department that somehow got really mobilized by this encounter and the actions of the Long Beach police, and really pushed for a complete disconnect and disengagement between the Cal State Long Beach police and immigration enforcement, with rallies of hundreds of students on campus to push to say that this should not happen again. As a result, the president of the campus at the end of last year, after about 3 or 4 months of organizing and pressure, instituted a new policy, and the police chief issued a directive in April that would or should have would have prevented this from taking place if it had been in place at the time. The directive from the police that was ultimately endorsed by the president of the campus required that the Cal State Long Beach police could not stop or detain people, any people, we're not talking about students only, but any individuals only for immigration status, cannot hold or detain people unless at a request of federal immigration authorities, cannot arrest people based on federal warrants issued by ICE, and couldn't arrest foreign nationals for alleged undocumented entry. And ultimately, the president of the Cal State system, over the course of the summer, not necessarily the best time for student organizing, issued a directive to individual campuses as a result of this experience in Cal State Long Beach to come up with policies of their own for each of the Cal State universities to come up with their own policy. Following the election, election of Donald Trump, the University of California very quickly, within a couple of weeks, announced that it would vigorously protect the privacy and civil rights of the undocumented members of the UC community, and directed its police departments not to undertake joint efforts with any government agencies to enforce federal immigration law. We're also involved in an effort now that would apply to the universities in California, but also elementary schools, high schools, and all law enforcement actors, known as the California Values Act, SB 54, that would be proposed state legislation that would keep California law enforcement and keep schools and other California local or state entities from having any engagement with federal immigration enforcement that is not mandated by law. So that's just, a little bit of background about some of the policy efforts and organizing efforts arising out of one particularly egregious case that preceded the election and has grown and evolved also subsequent to the election. But I also want to just follow on the conversations that we've already had at the earlier part of this webinar to emphasize the importance, but also the limited effect of changes in policies on their own. Good policy is part of the effort and definitely can have meaningful effects in terms of what immigration officers can do, what information they can have access to, what locations on site they can have access to. But it really, the implementation of that, the significance of that is really only going to depend on political support, and buy-in from everyone on campus, not just the policymakers, but students and faculty, workers, community members. That political support can be established through the development of a policy, especially if the policy is done in a really active, organized way, not necessarily only through, a president of a campus issuing a directive, but a broader coalition organizing around the development of the policy and really demanding that ICE not have any involvement in the campus and that the campus not have any role in immigration enforcement more broadly. One of the greatest effects of the work around the policy can be mobilizing, making people aware, resisting really egregious abuses by law enforcement on campus. And just to reiterate the points that Xiuming and Chamtoli had made, not just limited to immigration enforcement, but the egregious abuses from law enforcement on campus. And I think I don't think this has come up on this call before, but obviously I think most people are aware that the sanctuary movement came out of a lot, and preceded this as well, but a lot of organizing in the 1980s that came out of the faith community, with churches identifying that they are sanctuary spaces, churches and other religious institutions identifying that they are sanctuary spaces, often at great risk to themselves, with some church leaders being prosecuted in clear acts of civil disobedience, motivated by really outrageous immigration law and policy, but also their faith and history. And that became immensely powerful as an act of resistance, but also a provocation of other actions, of changes in city policy, of a real changed understanding from a broader section of the population, not just those individual faith institutions, but also a cross-section of society. And I think that's one of the things that we really hope to see with regard to the campus sanctuary movement and the school sanctuary movement, whether you're talking about universities or elementary schools or high schools, let's say even preschools, the student population, the faculty population, the worker population on campus on schools represents a really significant population in this country with an enormous amount of power when organized and mobilized. So the sanctuary movement should be seen not just as endorsing and creating good policies for individual campuses, but as something that really builds power, plugs in and activates new people, trains them, and helps them understand what the key issues are right now, and what the real risks are to the broader population. And then lastly, and this reiterates a lot of the points that others have made, but these really must be connected to fights against criminalization, racist police enforcement, including related to the presence of police on campus and targeting of other vulnerable groups. So it's really important not to undermine those efforts, but to strengthen them. And the work on Jose Alvarez's case in Cal State Long Beach in particular was joined with efforts to push back on aggressive immigration enforcement for people who have criminal convictions, not making a distinction and saying there should be immigration enforcement for some categories of people and not others. So I'm really glad to be part of this webinar, really glad to have so much involvement and collaboration, looking forward to work moving forward. I want to also just lastly put in a plug for our site, altotrump.com, where we have a number of resources that are available, and as Emma said, encourage broad usage and no need to ask. So thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Emmy. And at this point, I want to bring back Ariana to kind of close off the panel discussion. And I just want to underscore a couple of points, just for those who missed the beginning. Law at the Margins is a hub, and our mission is to kind of bring together lawyers, organizers, scholars, and activists for social change. We believe that an interdisciplinary, collaborative approach is the best approach towards social change. And so while there are policies and laws, and particularly one of the questions was about Pryor versus Doe as only limited to K through 12, that the policies are a departure point to organizing. And this is why the webinar is Lessons from Organizing. The law is one tool of it, and that we really have to engage sort of across sector. We were hoping to have panelists from Movimiento Cosecha, Brenda, to speak. We weren't able to bring her on today, but we hope that there'll be a future opportunity to do that, as well as one of the parent advocate in Culver City, who passed through sort of one of these sort of broad-based school board resolutions. I will circulate kind of a draft of that. That's not in the webinar guide. The webinar guide pulls together the information we had up to date. Please continue to link on the chat any resources that you may have that you think will be helpful, and we will make our best effort to distribute and disseminate that. But again, I want to just underscore that just with law or policy, even the best well-written really doesn't make much help on the ground if we are not all committed to mobilizing that. So with that, I wanted to bring back Ariana to talk a little bit about the history of the sanctuary movement and the role that churches and others were willing to play at times, to break the law, because the law itself is not necessarily favorable and provide dignity to immigrants and other communities of color. So is Emma, and to also share kind of her organizing work at CUNY and LaGuardia. So Ariana.
Thank you. So actually, I think it fits well that I'm the closer rather than the opener. So where I started from before I got cut off was kind of thinking about sanctuary from above and from below. And I would really say that the history of the religious community doing sanctuary in the 80s was very much from below, right? Like going against the law and housing people. And then from above is the kind of more contemporary version of cities, mayors, city councils kind of taking a political position that they're not going to turn over residents of their cities to ICE. So in thinking about that, we at LaGuardia have been trying to organize from above and from below, and using resources that already exist in Queens, which is where we're located in Queens, New York. So there are many organizations, especially grassroots organizations, that have been doing a lot of important organizing around these issues already, right, for decades. So now we're just trying to seek guidance from them and also get plugged into that larger network. So for example, in thinking about organizing from below, we had ICE Free Queens, which is part of the ICE Free NYC network. Some activists from that organization come to our campus to talk about some things that they've been doing, including trying to organize the religious institutions and get more information from them about which ones are willing to be part of this kind of underground network, as well as maybe even reach out to private people or different organizations that may have space. It's pretty unlikely, I would say, that our campus will ever be willing, that, you know, the administration of our campus will ever be willing to become a literal sanctuary in the kind of historical sense of the churches, where we're, as much as I think it would be a worthy cause to like open up the gym and put cots in there, I don't think that's ever going to happen. So in knowing that, we're trying to partner with organizations in Queens, like religious organizations, to find out for students where are those places of emergency as emergency safe spaces. And similarly, like what is happening in terms of civil disobedience and thinking about networks of people who will kind of intervene if there is an ICE raid. Is there a phone number that people can call, and then other people will come for backup as soon as possible. And then in addition, there is an organization that's mostly a South Asian organization called DRUM, which stands for Desi Rising Up and Moving, and they have a kind of platform that they've been building called Hate Free Zone in Queens and in New York City. And so we're also trying to get plugged into that at the Queens level and thinking about what does it mean for both like public and private spaces to declare themselves as part of this hate-free zones. And this is not just about undocumented immigrants or Muslims. It's also about the LGBT community and folks with disabilities. So all of this is, again, thinking about building coalitions, like Emmy was talking about, at different scales. And so because we're a commuter campus, it seems really central to think about sanctuary as a thing that the college can provide in terms of protecting student data and not turning over students to ICE and things like that, but in thinking about their lives like much more broadly and their communities much more broadly, and thinking about like the resources and organizing and grassroots efforts that are already in existence and building on those. I think I'll stop there.
Great. So Ariane, there was a question from one of the participants regarding curricular committees or ad hoc committees. And having sat in your meetings, I thought it would be interesting to share that, there are different layers of governance in a higher education. And so how, for example, in CUNY, we have the CUNY system citywide, myself as a faculty at BMCC, and we've talked a lot about using these sort of interstitial spaces for advocacy. And so I was wondering if you can speak a little bit specifically about the committee, and then more maybe just generally how you've thought through using the different governance spaces. So for example, the faculty senates or the faculty unions and the different sort of governance committees of the presidents to open up spaces, collaborating also with the student leadership of the CUNY Dreamers. So you can speak to that. And while Ariana is doing that, I want to encourage participants. I'm really heartened that it looks like from the chat, most of our participants are actively organizing and moving towards sanctuary, which means that this is a phenomenal group that we've assembled today. Our panelists are those who start us off in conversation. Just as a philosophy, Law at the Margins, we don't sort of believe in any notion of experts or expertise. So two things, invite you if you have a camera or a mic. If you want to share lessons that you have found from organizing, let me know in the chat box. If you have questions or questions for the panelists or for the group, post that as well as in the chat feature. And the last thing is we would love to know where you're logging in from. And Albert Garcia, our interactive producer who is behind the scenes, has set up a poll. And from the poll, you can log in and let us know where you're at. This will help us to fine-tune the support that we need to make at Law at the Margins towards your grassroots organizing effort. To get to the poll, underneath the video box, there's questions and topics, polls, and information. If you click on polls, you can let us know where you're coming from. Again, a reminder that we have a webinar guide that puts together a lot of these models. Into that guide, we will update it. If there's information that you want us to share, the best way to let us know is to put a link of that on our chat feature. And again, I want to, at the middle of the program, thank our co-sponsoring organizations, the National Immigration Law Center, National Education Association, National Immigration Law Center, as well as Asian Americans Advancing Justice in LA. They had put together a statewide coalition of educators and colleges, and included in the webinar is a letter that was sent to the California schools. So I encourage you all to take a look at that. Betty Hung from Asian Americans Advancing Justice was not able to join with us today, is a participating and co-sponsor of this webinar. Again, as I stressed, we can't do this alone in our silos. We have to do this together and collaboratively. And so this is precisely the mission of Law at the Margins. So Ariana, if you can speak to the question on the curriculum, I encourage everyone to post their questions on the chat features. Thank you very much.
So in terms of our different committees, people sort of self-selected to work on different sides of this issue of sanctuary, right? We're all kind of making this up as we go along because there's no sort of fixed definition of what a sanctuary campus is. And so we're building this, right? So there's one committee that was been sort of sanctioned, right, or you know, created by the president and the administration. And I'm sitting on that with faculty, staff, students, and some administrators. And so at that scale, sort of speaking to the point of how we're kind of activating these different sections of campus, at that scale, we're doing things like thinking about how to protect the student data, how to get funds for more lawyers on campus, because right now there's only a lawyer once a month, which is ridiculous. So kind of thinking about how we can use the administration to do the kinds of things that.
Okay, we may have lost Ariana in terms of her connection. So if she joins us again, we'll bring her back in. I am seeing a lot of wonderful organizing that's happening throughout California, student, high school level, and some also from school board associations. And so again, please post your questions or comments in the chat feature. Let us know if you would like to share lessons that you've learned through your organizing that would benefit this group. And so I encourage you again to post your questions. There's been a lot of sort of chat, so I hope I didn't miss any particular questions. Okay. Okay, maybe at this moment, I'll bring in Emma while we wait for Ariana to talk a little bit about the governance, a little bit the way in which Ariana was speaking about governance at the campus level, and you touched on a little bit in the beginning in your talk, but maybe other spaces in the school board, K through 12, places that might be activated. You know, we obviously will go towards the school board, but if the school board is a hostile place, or you're in a locality where the elected officials are hostile to sanctuary altogether, you know, what might be alternate spaces for advocacy that folks might sort of keep in mind that maybe not as visible?
Absolutely, thank you. I mean, right off the top of my head, you have your PTA, and you have, as we've talked about quite a bit, the unions on campus, on the K-12 school campuses, and those aren't just teachers' unions, but support services. You'll see a range of unions beyond teachers' unions whose work touch on the educational experience at school. So parent-teacher alliances are very persuasive stakeholders at the local level, as are the local and state affiliate of the labor organizations. The school board meetings, as I mentioned, are open to the public, so any member, particularly someone who lives within the school district, can and should request to join the school board agenda or speak during the public comment period as to how important a safe zone at your local school is to the entire community in terms of access to education, in terms of community priorities, shared beliefs, etc. If your school board is hostile, then I defer to the organizers on the call, the participants and the panelists, with respect to when not a picket line necessarily, but a protest that is targeted at school board members or local municipal leaders who are blocking these types of efforts, protests, and other concerted activity, whether it be, it doesn't need to be just the folks who work at school. Our schools are community hubs, like our libraries, our parks. They are part of our public space, and everyone under the age of 12th grade is affected by what takes place at school. So as Shamtoli emphasize, it's not necessarily for us to focus exclusively on the federal courts, which in some unfortunate future day will be analyzing this according to case law, nor is it for our school boards to play red light, green light about what political efforts we're able to put forward in a concerted way. I believe Ariana was speaking about different faculty groups. This is perhaps more typical of a higher education campus, but there are many committees, councils, faculty-driven committees and councils apart from the administration who can bring things forward. And your young people may have ideas. Your own kids, your local students, whether it be through a student newspaper or through speaking to their own teachers, if they're willing and able to do that. So I don't think, as Shamtoli emphasized, we need to limit ourselves to what we perceive to be a locus of power, whether it be our school board, our city hall, our state legislature, or the like.
Great, thank you, Emma. So again, I want to encourage folks who are sort of participating. I'm reading that many of you are actively organizing, in fact, organizing high school students, and to Emma's point about activating the communities that are most impacted in your spaces of the schools and the campus. If you would like to speak, I can invite you, just sort of let me know in the chat and I can invite you on. I'm going to, again, have Ariana sort of finish her thoughts regarding organizing at the campus level. If Xiuming is still with us, just invite her to share some concluding thoughts regarding immigration consequences, so that the goal isn't not to take action, but just to be aware of what the risk benefits are and to plan accordingly. So do we have Ariana to?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So just to finish my thoughts, I had been talking about what was sort of possible, I think, at the level of working with the administration. But of course, we don't want to stop there because that's going to be kind of like the least radical space in which we can work. Not that it doesn't still have potential, but it's not going to have the kind of radical potential that we're interested in. So that's why we formed these committees, we're calling them teams. And each team is made up of.
Oh, man.
Okay. So it's going to wait a moment. This is why technology is a tool, but it can't be the only way to organize. You always still have to go to the ground and people to people. So at this point, let's have Xiuming share kind of any concluding thoughts on immigration. There's been a number of questions that have come up that are really more about kind of the boundaries of these policies, sort of where do they end in terms of enforcement and what's included, not included. And I think that, so if you can speak to that and any other points that you think from your own organizing work and legal work that should be lifted up. And after Xiuming, I'm going to invite Matt Gonzalez, who will share about organizing high school students. And I think it's a perspective that we haven't heard, and so I definitely thank him for offering. If you are organizing or have some sort of points and lessons to share that we have not heard, let me know and I can invite you. You do have to have a camera or a mic for us to listen to you. If you want to flag any resources you've created, I suggest that you just link it to the chat feature and then we can pull those links up at the end of the webinar. So again, I'm just gonna hand it over to Xiuming.
Yeah, thanks. There's been a lot of questions about the outer limits of restricting ICE access to K-12 schools as well as college campuses. And so that's actually an area where we are doing some additional research. I welcome if people have specific questions to reach out to me because it's easier to give an answer when I know what locality a person is living in, because then we can touch on any of the state or local policies or laws that might come into play. So I don't have a really good general answer, except to say that, of course, these policies have a huge impact on making immigrants and their families feel more welcome and more protected. They might not ultimately provide 100% protection from deportation because we know there are many other spaces where ICE could pick up people. So I think that's where we can look at how these school policies interrelate to city policies, to local law enforcement policies, to make sure that there's as many places as possible that adopt policies that limit ICE. One other area where NILC is working on is with health centers and health clinics to make sure that people feel safe accessing healthcare and that information that's given on any kind of applications for healthcare are not then shared with ICE for enforcement purposes. So I think the more we have a continuum or multiplicity of spaces that really take on strong messages and strong policies saying we do not allow ICE to just indiscriminately come here and pick up people. ICE has to follow a process. Even if ICE shows up, we have a plan of protection in place. The better position will be starting next Friday once the president-elect takes office. And again, I encourage people to connect with other campaigns in your local areas, whether they are to push local government to fund attorneys for people facing deportation or to create a response network, because we do know people are going to be picked up. People are already getting picked up now under the Obama administration. So it's really critical that people create local self-defense groups and networks to be able to respond once that starts happening.
Great, thank you, Xiuming. And so there were a couple of questions that have come up regarding connecting us all and information, who we can contact to, for information if we're starting. So what I would suggest is that contact Law at the Margins. In the webinar guide is my direct contact. And based on your request, I will field that to folks who have been on the call, and so that you can be directed to the right local resource. And the other sort of suggestion is, if you are a organization willing to provide support in terms of these policies or organizing, let me know as well, so that Law at the Margins, being a hub, is more than happy to do the link up. That's precisely what our mission is. So with that, I'm going to now open it up for Q&A and also for comments. We have joining us Matt Gonzalez, who's going to talk about his work in New York City with high school students. And so thank you, Matt, for doing that. If anybody else has organized, has some information that you haven't heard, you think that we should lift up in this webinar, please let me know, and I can invite you to share. We're going to start to close and wind down this webinar, around 1:30 if there's no other questions. It will be recorded and posted. And again, thank you all for sharing the information that you have so far. So I'm just inviting Matt at this moment to share a little bit about his work. Thank you.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Am I good?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thanks for organizing. This has been very helpful and interesting. So I'll try to be brief about this, and then I'm happy to share my info if anyone has any other questions. In terms of what we're doing in New York City, and I noticed there's a bunch of folks from New York City, so we all need to get connected as well. But around high school student organizing, we have basically our biggest issue was the day after the election. A number of other educators and folks that work in our community were contacted by a lot of the students who are representing, communities of color or immigrant communities or Muslim communities, and their immediate concerns to us were fear and concern, and that those fears and concerns are rightfully there, and I think as we're seeing the Trump administration develop, those are going to become realities. So our immediate response was to really gather our young people and then start to work on kind of a multi-generational platform of student rights. We're not entirely sure how we're defining this, but we have a 10-point platform around creating youth sanctuaries. And at this moment, it's still a working process, and so we're always open to feedback from adults and young people as well. But the way we're trying to really use this is as developing this kind of platform, and then using that as an organizing tool for young people and older generations to really collaborate on doing a lot of the things that were talked about in this webinar, but really. The mayor in New York City has been, running around talking about New York City being a sanctuary city. And while that rhetorically is very important, we're very much interested in ensuring that all the municipal agencies, our educational spaces, all of our public spaces are sanctuary spaces, and reinforce that rhetoric. And so, around this platform is basically being expanded to, be a set of statements that have a practice ask in terms of, and just for example, so our first statement is we stand with immigrant youth. We stand for keeping immigrant families together and protected from hate crimes in schools and our communities. And the practice ask is putting a butterfly safe zone symbol on premises, just creating symbols that reinforce safe spaces. Training professionals working with young people on rights and identity of undocumented students, supporting and mentoring young documented people to understanding the realities and challenges of immigration. And so we have a practice ask, and then we have a policy ask, which is to uphold DACA, which we don't anticipate the new administration to do, but at the municipal level to refuse the enforcement of deportations and refuse deportation practices and trainings on school grounds. So that, as an example, is I guess a way that we're thinking about organizing our young people to advocate to the city and to the city institutions to promote and reinforce this youth sanctuary information. I'm so sorry, I have a phone call that I have to take, and but that's a quick kind of explanation of what we've been doing.
Great. So thank you so much. I think that happens when we have organizers on, and so we really appreciate all of the folks who have sort of participated. We're going to start to close off the webinar, and so there's been a lot of links and resources on the sort of chat feature. We're going to pull those resources together and send that over to you. I do want to invite our panelists to make any closing remarks before we sort of end today's program. And just a couple of logistical points. Again, there's, for those who may have joined sort of later to this webinar goal is to really pull together all the organizing and law strategies that have been used in policy. For those of you who are working on the ground, Law at the Margins' goal is to provide the sort of law and policy support to the organizing, and so these webinars are geared towards that. We can be a hub, so if there are any questions or follow-up, I posted my contact, shamtoli@lawatthemargins.com, to let us know what your needs are on the ground. It's going to be evolving. And the other thing before I sort of hand over with some closing call to action, what are some next steps as we see the inauguration of President-elect Trump, some call to action of what we need to sort of do at the moment. So before I do that, I just want to thank again our co-sponsoring organizations, which is the National Education Association. Thank Emma Lehaney in particular, just because our conversation actually led to this webinar, and that's basically how it happens. You know, we talk about what's needed, and then we create the resources to get what we need to get done. I want to thank the National Immigration Law Center, particularly Xuming Cheer for speaking, and Ignacio Rodriguez, who's a staff member behind the scenes also, who's been instrumental in the planning part. I want to thank the National Day Labor Organizing Network, Emmy McLean, as well as Brenda from Movimiento Cosecha. We were not able to have them on, but hopefully in the future, the staff there. And then Betty Hung from the Asian American Advancing Justice in LA. And then finally, you can never see him, but he's always sort of behind the scenes, Albert Garcia from Mi Familia Consulting, who has been sort of doing all the tech stuff and helping us to come together. So I am sure I have missed someone, and if I have, you know, give me grace and forgiveness. Thanks to all the registrants who have participated. We have folks who are on the ground doing this work, and we need to work together. We need to share our resources. Resources also in terms of funds as well to be able to do this organizing work. So with that, I'm going to invite, let's start with maybe Emma, and then Xuming, and then Emmy, to just give some closing thoughts and remarks.
Thank you, everyone. Again, it's such an honor to be on this panel with organizations I've so long admired, and now with all of you on the chat line as well, so many more opportunities to collaborate with. You know, a couple of related, I'm hoping y'all can hear me, just a couple of related items that I just flagged for you in the days ahead. One, the Bridge Act was introduced yesterday, a bipartisan federal bill that would extend DACA, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, and that's something certainly NEA, NILC, and many others, United We Dream, are working hard to move forward. And I think I'll leave you with that. There are many things moving forward. We know, as many have mentioned, that California legislature is looking at rolling something out, and the New Jersey legislature is doing the same with respect to its schools. We focused on local resolutions for organizing purposes, and because in many states, local progress can be made where statewide progress perhaps cannot quickly be made, but we're monitoring all of these. We have many affected member educators as well as countless affected students. So please count NEA among your
Okay, so I think we might have lost Emma but I think if I can complete or guess what Emma might have wanted to say, which is to count NEA, which is an organization of educators as a resource as you are organizing for sanctuary schools and campuses. Another resource that isn't on the list, but I think is really helpful, is a campaign by American Friends Service Committee called Sanctuary Everywhere. I will post that as well. So if you folks have the idea is that all aspects of our lives, of communities that are impacted, should be protected. So Xiuming, and then also if Emmy and Ariana want to share some concluding thoughts, and with their concluding thoughts, we'll close off this webinar.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for hosting this webinar, and also for everybody attending for sharing your experiences, particularly for the organizers, because I do firmly believe that we create change through organizing, and that there are many ways that advocates and lawyers can support the organizing, but it's really organizing from directly affected communities that ends up making the difference. So I think moving forward, it'd be great to think about how to continue to communicate, because we're going to have to be sharing information about ICE actions, where ICE is going out to arrest people and deport them, how ICE is doing that, who exactly they're targeting. So I think it'd be great to figure out ways to continue to share that kind of information so that we can better coordinate our response. And it seems like obviously there's much less work we can do on the federal level in terms of really convincing Congress to take any kind of positive actions. So I feel really inspired by all this movement on the state and local level to put into place pro-immigrant measures and other measures to protect vulnerable and marginalized communities. And so I would also just offer NILC as a resource moving forward. If you think there's particular types of materials that would be helpful, let me know. We always want to create materials that are actually used and are responsive to needs. We can also provide some feedback on language in safety zone or sanctuary school resolutions. So yeah, just please count on us as an ally, and I look forward to continuing to collaborate with you.
Great, thank you, Xiuming. We do have Emmy from the National Day Labor Organizing Network as an organizing group to share some concluding thoughts for the webinar. And if Ariana is still with us, I'll also invite her to share some thoughts. Just again to emphasize Xiuming's point, in the webinar, we have all the participating organizations. And so you can use that as a way to contact them directly. You're also welcome to contact Law at the Margins. We are interested in making sure that at least we have all of the information regarding Sanctuary that we can share with advocates. Tell us what you're finding so that we can adapt that and adjust that. And also let us know what gaps there are in terms of support. What are things that you would need to be able to effectively organize? The goal is for Law at the Margins is to facilitate local organizing, grassroots organizing, and to lift up the leadership of grassroots organizing. And so in terms as a mission, that's something that we're very much committed to as a connector. And that everything that we do is with the principle that those who are most impacted by whatever law and policy have to be at the forefront of any change making. And so that's a very clear articulation of our mission and philosophy. And so, so with that, I just want to make sure that we have Emmy on the line to be able to share some last thoughts about organizing, and then also Ariana. So do you have Emmy?
Yes, I don't think you can. I still think you might not be able to see me, but I understand you hear me.
Oh, it's an organizer strategy.
I just want to also first thank Chamtoli for organizing this whole thing after you thanked everyone else and Law at the Margins for making this happen. And on behalf of the National Day Labor Organizing Network, we're thrilled to be part of this and to engage further with groups as we move forward and to be an ally to all. And I guess in closing, I would want to emphasize that campus organizing, and I use campus broadly to think about universities and colleges, but also, you know, elementary schools and high schools, can be a site of tremendous social change, even beyond the campus. So make sure that we are thinking beyond particular policy adoption. We're obviously at a really critical moment, and the fact of the imminent inauguration of Donald Trump can be a real motivating force, and should be a real motivating force, to get the strongest policies possible as quickly as possible, to make sure that they are as airtight as possible, although, you know, recognizing the potential limitations because of the power of federal immigration enforcement. But let's use that also to always build power and act in solidarity on and off campuses. We know because of the egregious abuses that are likely to come from this incoming administration, and the fact that the executive is going to be joined by Congress and the courts probably very soon. The possibility of federal policy change is limited. And we are seeing that the new alternative sources of power, and not necessarily alternative, these are always really strong sources of power, but even more critical now are at the local level in cities and towns and counties, as well as school boards and PTAs and universities and colleges and elsewhere, and very, very, very importantly on the streets. And so we hope that the organizing around sanctuary campuses can be really a critical way to be engaging, exercising, and building resistance both at the local level and on the streets, and to be bringing more people into those movements. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Emmy. Again, I want to invite Ariana to, oh, there you are, share some thoughts, concluding thoughts in terms of moving forward. And also, I think there's, as someone who's been organizing with Ariana and the CUNY system as a faculty, there's always this sort of notion that, if you're in New York, then it's a hospital, that it's a favorable ground. I mean, we do have folks who are maybe can listen, but there's still challenges. So I think we do have to kind of break up this, this mythos of the North versus the South around organizing, and get past this binary and really be kind of grassroots to grassroots, and as what Ariana said, bottom, sort of grassroots up and not grass tops down. So Ariana, some concluding remarks, and then I'll just sort of close out with just some kind of logistics moving forward from Law at the Margins, since that's come up a fair amount in the chat. So Ariana.
Yeah, thanks again for organizing this. And I would just really echo a lot of what Emmy said. But yeah, at CUNY, so far only one president has been brave enough to sign their campus's Senate resolution, whereas almost every CUNY campus now has a Senate resolution. So it's true that we maybe are in a hospitable environment, but it's also true that we're also seeing a lot of resistance and fear. But I see it as an opportunity. Already, we're building coalitions with the union, student groups, like I said, grassroots groups in Queens and in New York City as a whole. And it's been a long time, I would say, since all of those sort of scales and different institutions have come together and built a coalition around a single, though complicated issue. So I see it as a really positive thing. And also just lastly, already we've been seeing students kind of take on leadership roles. And I see this as also an opportunity to kind of help inspire and build new leadership and organizers and activists. So as much, as big as the challenges are, I think is also as much kind of as the power and potential. That's it. Thanks.
Great. So again, thank you to Ariana, Emma, Xueming, and Emmy for speaking in today's panel. Thanks to all of those who are, I guess, participant panelists. We're trying to break this divide of experts and participants, but for sharing your expertise and your lessons from organizing. Continue to do that. So those of you who missed the beginning, my name is Shamtoli Haq, and I am an attorney and founder of Law at the Margins, and come to this work through 20 years of providing grassroots support to organizing and mobilizing and to vulnerable communities. Law at the Margins' goal is to provide information towards and support to organizing and to lift up campaigns. We do that through our website and writing. So I want to encourage all of you who are on this webinar to consider posting an article for lawatthemargins.com. You can write a short article about your organizing work, lessons learned, and we will publish that at lawatthemargins.com. And then secondly, we host these webinars as a connector to share information towards mobilizing support. If you are looking for sort of resources or you're looking to connect for support around this issue, contact, again, all of this is in the webinar guide, which you can click on, which is above, I believe below the video box, but I also posted it on the chat, Shamtoli at lawatthemargins.com, and we can connect you to all of the organizations that are doing phenomenal work that are co-sponsored this Sanctuary webinar. Also, just follow us on our Facebook and subscribe to Law at the Margins. In addition to Sanctuary issues, we focus on a number of other issues regarding labor. A big part of our work is also around movement solidarity across the globe, so not just America. And so there are a number of other areas, and we're trying to kind of cross-pollinate across our issue areas so that we don't work in our silos. Again, thanks to Albert, thanks to our panelists, thanks to all of our participating and co-sponsoring organizations. And please share your contact on the chat feature. We'll pull that. And we do have, I think, an email of all who registered, and we'll share the information with that. But the best way, I think, so that you don't miss any of the information is to join our Law at the Margins Facebook page and Law at the Margins subscription. That's the way that we communicate to all of you. So with that, have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you so much.